Good evening. God is great. God means everything to me. God is essential to my life. He is the central figure. He is at the core of everything I do. He's the heart of it all. Are things that we often say, and a lot of times we say them, and then we repeat them, and then other people say them, and then we repeat those things that they said. And sometimes we get stuck in the trap of saying the vague platitudes and never actually really reflecting on what those things mean. What does it mean that God means everything to you? It means that you plan your Sunday evenings, that you don't schedule anything else at 6 o'clock because you're going to be at church. Okay, but is that all? Is there more than that? Is there something else that's supposed to be there? Why do I care about God so much? This evening, what we're going to do is look at the book of Joshua. Some of the readings that we've had this past week, we're going to start in chapter 6, actually, and go through chapter 10, and do a brief survey of several stories that Israel has taken part in. Several stories that have to take place in the land of Canaan, in the conquest, asking, what exactly is God doing? Why should Israel care about what God is doing and how God is working through them? There's a line in the Bible somewhere, we love him because he first loved us. What does that look like? What is the work of God? And why should God be so important to us? We all say he is, but why is he? Well, I would argue because he's first put all the work forward towards us. You'll see that in an unconventional way as you look through the account of Joshua. Starting in chapter 6, we'll look at Jericho briefly. I already talked about it a lot last week. I'm not going to re-preach that again. But then you'll hit several different instances, each associated with a different city, a different town, a different location that Israel is in, and each proof of how much God cares about them. Even though they're not really listening and working with him, they're proofs of how God works for them. And he's asking, appealing to them, that Israel might return the favor. And so as we get started, we're just going to ask this question, what is God's work? And as you work through the stories, you'll see different aspects of it. First location you would come to is Jericho in chapter 6. It's a story that likely you're familiar with. If nothing else, then hopefully from last week you remember some of those things that we talked about. God, in summary, I'm not going to read that story over again. God commands Israel to walk around a city, and eventually the walls collapse. It's not something that Israel encounters by themselves. It's not something that Israel does because they're so strong or so powerful. It's not something that Israel earns. It's not a victory that they accomplish by their own strength, but rather it is something that happens because God commands that it happens. The walls fall down because God said so. He said so because Israel showed their faith. They walked around a city wall 13 times over the course of 1 week, not seeing any changes. They made a great shout, and God saw their faith. They acted as he commanded them, and he collapsed the walls for them. Jericho is a reminder that God's work is to step in and win battles for his people. That's something God does for us. And sometimes we say that and then we kind of move on, don't really appreciate that. What does it mean to say that God wins your battles? It means that when the people of God come under fire, God is there to protect them. It means that when the holy people are attacked, God steps in to defend them. It means that when God's people need to attack evil and go out and conquer the forces of darkness, that God is there. He is the strength behind them. He is the might that they work from. He is their center. He is their inspiration to defeat their enemies. When you fight today, when I was in college, my friends and I would, talk back and forth, and every now and then you ask one of them how they're doing, and the report on their day would be, I'm just fighting demons today. That means it's a bad day. That means something's going wrong. It's true. Fighting demons, fighting the forces of Satan and temptations in your lives. How do you fight those? Well, you won't. But God can do it for you. When you look at the collapse of Jericho, when you look at the fall of those walls, it's a simple message. God wins the battles for his people, not because they deserve it, but because he's merciful. and he gives it to them. And just as Israel's faith was made manifest in following the words of God, walking around the wall, so too is our faith made manifest as we follow the law of God and work in obedience with the law that he's given us. How does God work? He defeats the enemies, he collapses the walls, he allows you victory towards righteousness. And that's a message we know. That's a message we saw last week, hopefully. And so you'd think that when Israel sees those things happen, that they, remember that. And they remember to work with God. They remember to have faith. They remember that God is the one who wins the battles. But as you get into chapter 7 and 8, you run across a city named Ai, or Ai. I don't like saying it that way, but you can if you want to. Run into a little city named Ai, and Joshua thinks he can take it. And so as you start this account in Joshua 7, this is what it says. In verse 2, Joshua 7, Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth Aven. It's east of Bethel. He tells them, go up and scout the land. And so the men went up and they scouted Ai. And after returning to Joshua, they reported to him, don't send all the people up there. Send about 2,000, maybe 3,000 men to go and attack Ai. Since the people are so few, don't wear out all our people up there. And so about 3,000 men went up to defeat this little city. Do you realize what's happening? What's happening is Joshua is doing the same tactic that he used against Jericho. In Joshua 2, Joshua sent 2 spies to scout out the land of Jericho, the city of Jericho, to see what their defenses were, to bring a report back to him. And the report is brought back, a plan is formulated, Israel goes and conquers the city without problems. It's the same pattern here, except there's one important piece missing. He sends out the spies. They come back. They bring a favorable report. We can conquer that city. But instead of asking God for a battle plan, the Israelites devise one on their own. And they go up with 3,000 men to conquer the city of Ai. And guess what happens? It's in the latter half of verse 4. The 3,000 men went up and they fled from before the men of Ai. The men of Ai struck down about 36 of them and chased them from outside the city gate down to the quarries, striking them down on the descent. And as a result, the people lose heart. Why did they fail? Israel took Jericho without any casualties, and yet you lose 36 men to this small little village. But you realize what the problem is. Because they don't seek God, because they had that victory that God gave them over Jericho, and it empowered them to think that they were better than they were. Actually, what happens, Joshua complains to God in verses 6 through 9. He cries out to God, why did you allow this to happen? And God answers in verse 10. The Lord said to Joshua, stand up. Why have you fallen face down? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I appointed for them. They took some of what was set apart. They have stolen, deceived, and put those things with their own belongings. This is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They will turn their backs and run from their enemies because they have been set apart for destruction. I will no longer be with you unless you remove from among you that which is set apart. You realize what's happening? Somebody sinned. It's recorded in verse 1. Israel didn't know about it, but God did. Achan stole something. Achan stashed it away in his tent, and God was not going to help this people until they got right with him. The message of chapters 7 and 8 is that God's work is to cleanse the people's sins. God's work is to look at people's lives and find the evil and cut it out from them. He knows that Achan sinned. He goes in and commits drastic surgery on Israel, naming off the families one by one until he narrows it down to Achan. God's the only one who knew. He's the only one capable of finding the evil, but he finds it and he removes it with the help of Israel. Too often when we're out fighting Satan, we fight him off by God's strength. We resist a temptation, a strong temptation, by God's strength. Maybe we have one success, maybe we have a string of successes, and we start to get pretty confident. And we think, that little city of Ai, it's really not worth asking about. If we could take Jericho, if I could beat that big temptation, if I could fight off Satan in that way, I don't need help with this little one. and God proves them all wrong because they have sin in his midst. One success doesn't mean you're competent. A string of successes doesn't mean you've outgrown the need for God's help. But Israel doesn't realize that. They pursue their own ends without realizing the evil that's in there. It's only when they go to God that he reveals the evil to them. It's only when they follow God's will that they remove the evil and stone Achan to death. It's only then that God gives them a plan in chapter 8 to take the city of Ai. It's only when they follow that plan exactly and follow God's will that they successfully conquer that city without any casualties this time. Because when they follow God's plans, they succeed. You're not going to outgrow God. You're not going to outgrow the need for God. Don't get a big head. Submit to God. Follow him. These people are so excited about conquering the land of Canaan. That's a good thing. They're so excited about conquering the land that they forget to ask God if it's okay if they do. So excited to do righteousness that they forget to ask the author of righteousness. It's a little bit of putting the cart before the horse. If they sought the will of God, then they would succeed without any problems. And so you'd think that they learn from this. You'd think that if you suffered a great defeat at the hands of a tiny city, you might rethink. You lost 36 people. 36 people just died so that you could learn your lesson. You'd think that they would, harbor some level of memory of that in their minds. And they do for about, half a day. Until you get to chapter 9 and a place called Gilgal. Gilgal is a camping place for Israel. It's a place where they had set up their base of operations, shall we say. It's the place where Joshua is staying, and it's the place where some people come and con Israel into an agreement. In Gilgal, Joshua is there, and while they're there in chapter 9, starting in verse 1, all these kings hear about the success of Israel. They hear about Jericho, they hear about Ai, and those who are west of the Jordan in the hill country and the Judean foothills, and all along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea up towards Lebanon, the Hethites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, they form a unified alliance to fight against Joshua and Israel. They've heard of God's victories, Israel's victories, but really the victories that God inspired, and they're terrified of them. They form up to make a consolidated army. But one city doesn't. Gibeon, which is called later on a large city, like a royal city in chapter 10 and verse 2, this would be one of the stronger cities that exist in the land. They realize they're not going to win by teaming up against God with all the rest of the land. And so they come up with a genius plan. It starts in chapter 9 and verse 3. When the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to both Jericho and Ai, they acted deceptively. They gathered provisions and took worn-out sacks on their donkeys and old wineskins that were cracked and mended. They wore old patched sandals on their feet, threadbare clothing on their bodies. Their entire provision of bread was dry and crumbly. They went to Joshua in that camp at Gilgal, and they said to him and to the men of Israel, "We have come from a distant land. Please make a treaty with us." Their evidence is not much. Israel questions that, of course. Are you sure you're not from here? Your accent sounds familiar. Are you sure you're not from the land of Canaan, from right in among us? Because we're not allowed to ally with Canaanites. We're told to drive them out. I think Mike talked about that this morning. We were told to get rid of them from the land. That would not be acceptable, but of course, the Gibeonites just lie and tell Joshua something else. In verse 12, they say, this bread was warm when we took it from our houses as food on the day that we left to come to you, but now it's dry and crumbly. These wineskins, they were new when we filled them, but now they are cracked. These clothes and sandals of ours, they're worn out from the extremely long journey. It's just lying. It's not very clever. And it's honestly not a very good plan when you think about it from God's perspective. You're talking about the God who just collapsed the walls of Jericho without breaking a sweat. You're talking about the God who's aware enough of his people, of every individual doing every individual action, that he knows what Achan did even when no one else in Israel does. He's able to call out Achan by name, and he holds Israel accountable even when no one else knows that they've sinned. God is so detail-oriented. You'd think that a being this powerful would know. What does Gibeon hope to achieve with this kind of a lie coming to the people of Israel? The only thing more disappointing to me about the quality than the quality of this plan is the fact that the plan actually works. You know why it works? They tell you in verse 14, the men of Israel took some of their provisions and they did not seek the Lord's decision. Joshua established peace with them. Joshua made a treaty to let them live. The leaders of the community swore an oath to them because they didn't seek the Lord's decision. You know what this tells you about what God's work is? God's work is to make those decisions. God's work is to inform your decisions. One of the things he promises over and over is wisdom for those who ask for it. You can go to James chapter 1 if you want to. God promises wisdom if you ask in faith without doubting. You read the book of Proverbs. Adults are studying that on Wednesday night. It's God's wisdom that's been revealed for us that we can take and use in our lives. How many times has God told us that we can seek his wisdom, that we can ask for it, that we can pursue it, and he'll give it to us freely? And then nobody does. Have you ever known people of faith, and maybe this is you, who say, you know, God is wise, God is all-knowing, God is powerful, God is intelligent, God is the one being who knows everything there is. We say that in church, we come here together, we say that in the Bible class, we tell each other that, and then we go home and start making decisions and we forget to pray about it. We forget to consider the things of God. We forget to read his word. We forget to pursue his knowledge and instead just choose things based on our ideas. Sometimes those decisions go fine. Sometimes they work out. And sometimes, like in this chapter, they don't. And yet too often people who say that God is the greatest and wisest forget to ask him for his help and his knowledge. My mom used to call me the font of useless information. God is the font of useful information. And yet we forget. And yet we go about it. We go about life. We go about our decisions based on ourselves and our intelligence instead of the Lord. How foolish. How foolish is that? It's so frustrating to even recognize when that's happened to me. When I've chosen to do that, it's disappointing. And obviously, the secret doesn't last, and Israel finds out about it. It takes a whole 3 days, according to verse 16. About 3 days later, they hear that the Gibeonites are their neighbors. They go and approach them, but then at that point, they've promised not to murder them, and so, well, there's nothing else for it. They do press them into hard labor, into slavery in verse 21, so I guess that's kind of close, but it's not what God commanded. It's not what God was looking for. God's word has been ignored because Israel forgot to ask. It's God's job to win your battles if you want him to. It's God's job to cleanse your sins. He's willing to if you want. It's God's job. His work is to inform your decisions, to give you wisdom if you ask for it. But Israel and we often fail to seek the Lord. So there are consequences. Now Israel, God's holy people, now they have to live with unholiness in their midst because they didn't seek the Lord. Joshua does keep his word. He doesn't kill Gibeon. He violates one of God's commands to follow another of God's commands. And now the whole situation is terrible because he did not seek the Lord. So eager in the conquest, so eager to make peace with this one people, to go and cleanse the rest of Canaan, they forgot to ask for God. And so they fail. And now they cannot accomplish the will of God. as he called them to. And so you'd think that after this, Israel would remember. And so you'd think that after this, after these repetitions, you'd think that Israel would start to realize, hey, maybe we should rely on God. God helped us with Jericho and everything went well. We didn't ask him for anything with Ai and everything went poorly the first time. When he helped us with Ai the second time, it went great. We didn't ask him about Gilgal and now it went poorly. You'd think that Israel would start to understand that there's a pattern here. But what happens when you get to chapter 10 is the same story. You get to chapter 10 and now you're dealing with Gibeon itself. See, Gibeon made a choice to ally themselves with Israel, and that means they're allied against the land of Canaan, and Canaan doesn't like that. And so 5 kings band together and attack Gibeon, presumably to capture the city and use the armies for their own, draft them into conscription work for them. 5 kings join up to attack, and Gibeon needs help, and so they call on their newfound allies, the people of Israel. And now Joshua's caught between a rock and a hard place, because it turns out he's in a war that he didn't ask for, and really one that's not going to be very good for him. He's fighting 5 kings at once. That was probably not his plan. He's fighting in an unfavorable situation. He's attacking a besieged city, which is never going to go well strategically. He doesn't have supply lines. He doesn't have the plans in place. He's not prepared to take on this war, but these are the consequences of not having sought God. And so Joshua has to act accordingly. Israel is called to war in verse 6 in Joshua chapter 10, starting in verse 6. And I want you to listen to these verses carefully, because unfortunately, I think sometimes we might misread what's there. Joshua 10 and verse 6, Then the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, Don't give up on your servants. Come quickly and save us. Help us. All the Amorite kings living in the hill country have joined forces against us. So Joshua and all his troops, including all his best soldiers, they came from Gilgal, and the Lord said to Joshua, Don't be afraid of them. I have handed them over to you. Not one of them will be able to stand against you. It's the promise of God. Usually when I've heard this taught, this is the day the sun stood still. Usually when I've heard this story taught, I've heard it taught this way, that Joshua finally remembered God, that Joshua finally went to God and got God's approval, and God was with him, and that's why he was successful. You can disagree with me if you want to. You're always free to disagree with me if you want to. But I don't think that's what happened. Not to my reading, anyway. Gibeon calls Joshua. Joshua goes in verse 7. There's no mention of him going to God about it. God steps in verse 8 and gives him an assurance, but I don't think that's because Joshua was asking, at least not to my reading. It seems as if Joshua went up and God is intervening. Because, think about it, if Israel loses this war, then Gibeon, God's new allied nation, just dies, and it looks like God can't protect his allies. If Israel loses this war, then it looks like God loses when a bunch of kings join together. If Israel loses this war, then God's name is dishonored, and that's not acceptable. When I read this, it doesn't look like Joshua sought the Lord's help. It looks like God intervened for the sake of his own name. And he steps down and he says, Joshua, I will win this war for you. And that's ultimately the lesson that you see from this chapter. It's the same lesson that you saw back in chapter 6. It's the same lesson that you learned in Jericho when God collapsed the wall and won the war for Israel. It's the same lesson because they need the same lesson. That God's the one who's enabling their success and their victory. But evidently, Israel hasn't understood that yet. And so they need a repetition of the same lesson over and over. It's not unfamiliar. I mean, how many times in the wilderness did Israel complain? They complain about their food, and so God fixes it. They complain about their water, and so God fixes it. They complain about their food again and again, and a couple more times on top of that. How many times did they complain about God's leadership? The golden calf with Korah is another instance against Moses and Aaron right there against Moses just before in Numbers chapter 12. How many times do they repeat the same thing, the same problem? Because they won't learn the lesson the first time. And you look at this and we say, we laugh at Israel a little bit. They're such a silly people. They never learn their lesson. They could just listen to God the first time, and then they wouldn't have to have this repetition. They wouldn't have to have it beat into them. They could learn the easy way. And then you think about your own life, and how often have you done exactly the same thing over and over again, even when you know exactly what God is telling you? How many times have you sinned against God, been sorry for it, repented of it, and then gone right back into it? Maybe it's the same week. Maybe you last a month. Maybe you don't even last a day, and it's the same thing, and you do it a few times in a row. Morning, and then afternoon, and then evening for good measure. 7 times in one day. God still forgives, but it's still sin. How many times do we need the same lesson beat into our heads over and over and over again before we finally, ultimately learn that it's God is the one who has all these things. God is the one who wins the victory, and the Israelites just aren't getting it. But I don't think we get it either sometimes. Justice would have God let this people just go and die because they're going on their own. But mercy has God step in and protect them from themselves and deliver them. See the goodness of God here. And in the end, as we read, even in the scripture reading this evening, God is the one who wins the victory. You see it in chapter 10 in verse 7. Joshua goes up with all his troops and all his best soldiers. But in verse 8, the Lord says, I have handed them over to you. In verse 9, Joshua caught them by surprise. He marched all night from Gilgal. But in verse 10, the Lord threw them into confusion before Israel. He defeated them in a great slaughter at Gibeon. He chased them through the ascent of Beth Horon, struck them down as far as Azekah and Makkedah. As they fled from Israel, the Lord threw large hailstones on them from the sky along the descent of Beth Horon all the way to Azekah, and they died. More of them died from the hail, that is from God. More of them died from God than the Israelites killed with the sword. Who won the victory? On that day, the Lord gave the Amorites over to the Israelites. Then Joshua, in a good moment of faith here, he is a good leader when he puts his mind to it. Joshua spoke to the Lord and he asked the Lord to make the sun stand still. There aren't enough hours in the day to accomplish the work that God has given us. Pause the day. Let the sun stand still. Let it hang over this valley. And God did. And God let it happen just as Joshua asked. So the length of the day was extended. God gave Israel the opportunity to finally fully obey his plan as he had commanded it. And the comment in verse 14 is, there has been no day like it before or since when the Lord listened to a man, because the Lord fought for Israel. Who won? It's not Israel who defeated them. It's not Israel who caused the terror and confusion. It's not Israel who struck them. Israel didn't kill the majority of them. Israel didn't stop the sun. God stepped in. Even though his people are unwise and stubborn, even though his people have failed to learn the lessons before, even though his people are not all that great, God still steps in to help. Because that's the work he has decided to do. It's the same message over and over and over again, that God is working for you if you'll just pause and recognize all the good that he's doing. We read the book of Joshua, and generally Joshua seems to be considered the bright spot in the midst of all the bad stuff. It's the book of Israel's successes. And to some extent it is. It's better than Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Definitely better than Judges, which you're going to see next week. But I would call it more than a book about Israel's successes. I think it's a book about God's successes, sometimes in spite of what Israel does. Because God is willing to step in. God has a job he wants to accomplish, and he will accomplish his work, even when these people are not the most receptive to it. But he gives them opportunity after opportunity to see the work he's doing for them, to see the blessings he's providing to them, to see the effort he's extending for them, so that they can properly respond in faith and take the land by his command. They followed in Jericho. They learned a lesson at Ai. They learned a lesson at Gilgal. They learned a lesson at Gibeon. And the hope is they don't have to have it beat into them anymore. Of course, if you know the story, that's not exactly how it goes. But there is hope that they might turn around and listen. The question for us today, as you're reflecting on these ancient stories of ancient wars, God hasn't commanded us to go into a land and capture it. That's not a Christian's job. That's not the role of us today. We have a different battle, a spiritual one. But the question is, have you learned these lessons? Or do you need the repetition that they offer? Have you learned the lesson of Jericho, that God wins the battles of the faithful ones? Or are you still trying to fight Satan on your own and failing because it doesn't work? Have you learned the lesson of Ai, that you need the Lord's forgiveness to have a relationship with him before you can succeed? Or are you still trying to go about your life without that relationship by yourself and trying to succeed on your own? You can't do it. Have you learned the lessons of Gilgal, that you need God's advice for where to go? You need God's advice for how to live? Or are you still trying to live by your own ideas, with your own mind, in your own way? Did you learn the lesson of Gibeon, that God conquers your enemies if you're faithful to him? He's repeating these lessons not merely for Israel's benefit. He's repeating these lessons because they're the same ideas we still need to get into our heads today. And yet so often we read them and we read the battles and they're exciting, and then we move on. And we fail to appreciate the work that God has put forward for his people. My admonition to you, my encouragement to you from all of this, don't make God come down and accomplish his work in spite of you. Seek God's help and let him accomplish his work through you. Because every time Israel did it, every time Israel followed God, everything went off without a hitch. God offers us that same opportunity and that same chance if we will but follow him instead of forgetting to seek him. I'd agree that God is absolutely essential to our lives, but I'm also one of those people who forgets. That's not what we're called to do. We're called to be mindful of the Lord, to remember what he actually does, the love which he first showed to us, so that we might love him in return. I will work for God, not just because, it sounds good in the moment, not just because my church family tells me to, not just because that's what I grew up doing, but I will work for God because I know the work he's done for me. He's given Jesus for us, and he's asking you to respond. If there's anything we can do to put you in a right relationship with him, so that you can repair your relationship, so that you have one that's going to withstand the test of time, so that you have something where God is willing to step in and help you to fight off the evil one, so that God forgives you, so that God can guide you and help you through your life. If you're willing to humble yourself before him, if you're willing to submit to his will, you're more than welcome to come and make that known. Come and talk to me. I'll be right here as we all stand and sing this song together.